You can have a great technology, a real innovative technology or use of data, but if individuals don't trust it, they're not going to use it. And so we think that really the key benefit of many benefits of the NIST Privacy Framework is helping for organizations to establish that trust.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative and Wiz is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership with one of the contributors to my latest book, the best-selling CISO Compass: Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, as well as from other top CISOs and security thought leaders. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC or visit cyberleadersunite.com. I am your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Dylan Gilbert, NIST Privacy Policy Advisor and lead for the NIST Privacy Framework.
Well, thanks for having me, Todd. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and chat with you. Good question. What attracted me to the privacy space? Well, I started out working as an attorney in DC on copyright, on IP issues. And that was my background prior to law school, was in the music industry, actually. And so, I came out to DC to do policy in the intellectual property space. And it didn't take too long for me to realize that copyright was kind of one of the main issues in this larger space of technology policy. When the internet arrived, it kind of was a disrupting factor, to say the least, when it came to law. I mean, our everyday lives as well, of course, but then the law as well that was written, before the internet, and in many ways kind of struggled to keep pace with the innovation and the activities and the issues that arose that were related to the internet. And one of those, in addition to copyright and intellectual property, was privacy. I found it to be deeply fascinating and really important. This wasn't something that was new. Of course, we've had privacy on the radar screen for quite some time. I mean, in particular, since the Privacy Act back in the 70s. And then, of course, to the extent to which privacy is implicated in cybersecurity. But, this was a time when the large tech companies were really, really kind of exploding in their influence and size. And they had a business model that they continue to have a business model that's based on targeted advertising and data collection. And you had all these other ways in which data were being leveraged for a lot of great things, a lot of innovative things. For public health benefits and for education and all kinds of stuff, but there were very real privacy implications to all of this, and I found the issue to be both important and fascinating. So I kind of opened up the aperture a bit of what I was working on, from copyright to privacy, and then eventually just kind of went all in on privacy. I was working in the think tank nonprofit space here in DC, and ended up leading our privacy work there. And so, kind of the next stop after that was NIST, where I am now in the privacy engineering program.
Yeah, and you make a great point. I mean, I think all the tech companies and having access to all that information, that's, kind of raised the bar around privacy, and it's brought it to the end consumer in our daily lives.
Yeah, exactly. I think that there was always an extent to which, folks are thinking about their privacy, and privacy is one of those things that's it's a very personal thing, right? Some folks are more sensitive to privacy. They want to. You see it just in the everyday behavior of a person. You might have someone who's a bit more of a recluse, and they like to stay out of the spotlight and mind their own business, and want other folks to mind their business when it comes to them. And then you've got folks that love being in the spotlight. They love being out there and and don't really have as much sort of sensitivity, I suppose you could say, when it comes to their personal privacy. And so that translates to the digital world as well, where there are some folks that really are more sensitive to the types of ways in which they and the data that is associated with them can be used, and others that may have less strictness or sensitivity to that. And so I think that always existed, but I do think that because of kind of a combination of factors, not the least of which was what we talked about, just sort of the increasing size and influence of companies that collect data and use it for various reasons, these types of issues became more top of mind for folks. And I think that it's certainly something that now, I was just in San Francisco for the RSA conference earlier this year. And, billboards all over the place from Apple talking about, basically competing on privacy now, right? And saying, this is, we're giving you privacy. That's why you should choose our company. So that was definitely not something that was happening, even 5 years ago, really. So lots of change, but I do think that it's kind of more top of mind for sure for the everyday folks.
Yeah, some companies have really gotten into that. I remember, the first step into all of that was, will security be used as a competitive, marketing attempt, and now we see that the privacy is as well.
Yeah.
So you've been working with NIST. What's your role been with NIST?
Yeah. So after leaving the think tank nonprofit space, I came over to NIST in the privacy engineering program. For those folks that may not be familiar with NIST, we're we could call ourselves, I suppose, the nation's measurement agency, and what the privacy engineering program within NIST is a relatively new program, and our mission is to use measurement science and systems engineering principles to create guidelines and tools and resources to protect privacy and to sort of further the creation of trustworthy information systems. And so within PEP, the Privacy Engineering Program, I work and lead our work on the NIST Privacy Framework. That's sort of my main job. So outreach and awareness around what the NIST Privacy Framework is, how it can help organizations with their privacy risk management, and have a couple other parallel work streams that are related to the privacy framework. Most notably that I've been spending a lot of time on is our privacy workforce public working group, where we are getting folks from the public, every conceivable type of stakeholder, public sector, private sector, civil society, academia, to come together and identify task, knowledge, and skills that are aligned with the NIST privacy framework to kind of help organizations that are looking to implement the NIST privacy framework, but may need a little bit more guidance on the types of workforce knowledge, skills, and activities they may need to carry those things out. So we're a small but mighty team, so we all chip in on various other activities as necessary. But certainly, I would say that the majority of my work is around the privacy framework.
So what was the impetus? What was the reason for NIST deciding that they needed to establish this privacy framework?
Yeah, so the privacy framework, if you go back in time, I'm sure you're familiar with, and most people are familiar in this space with the NIST cybersecurity framework. Yep. Something that has been around for quite some time now. The cybersecurity framework was out doing cybersecurity risk management guidance, offering that to organizations. And, stakeholders were out there basically saying, hey, it's time for NIST to do something. We'd like to see NIST do something similar in the privacy context. Privacy risk management framework that's voluntary, consensus-based, law, technology agnostic is something that the stakeholders signaled pretty clearly was going to be helpful for helping to ensure that the organizations had a resource, some help, some guidance around what it's going to take to make sure that you're optimizing the beneficial uses of your data, which are many, but also understanding that data processing comes with privacy risks, and those can depend on the nature, the extent of the data processing, a number of different factors and considerations. And so having the type of framework that could be in place to help organizations with that risk management was something that they found was needed and helpful. And now at that point, the privacy engineering program had already created some important privacy risk management tools with the NIST IR 8062 document that the listeners may be familiar with. And, preceding the NIST Privacy Framework, there was already a NIST privacy risk assessment methodology that was in place, as well as privacy engineering objectives, sort of a companion triad of objectives to exist along with the well-known CIA triad, right, of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data that was familiar to folks doing cybersecurity risk management. PEP had already worked on creating these privacy engineering objectives of predictability, manageability, and disassociability. So you have those that are introduced and now in place, as well as the privacy risk assessment methodology, the PRAM. So the overarching privacy framework could then provide this opportunity for organizations to have this framework to build their privacy risk management program around. And then to the extent that it made sense as they were working on, developing and deploying system products and services, they could really engineer privacy into those using the NIST privacy engineering objectives, as well as the privacy risk assessment methodology, if they so chose. So it really was kind of a reasonable and helpful next step in the resources that NIST was creating on the privacy front.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers. Sounds like a logical evolution to bring all that together. So there's different components of this. There's the core, the profiles, the implementation tiers. Could you give a brief explanation of how all that, what those things are and how they fit together?
Yeah, we'd love to. And so again, for the folks out there listening that are familiar with the cybersecurity framework, they don't have to, I don't know what the analogy to squinting would be in the podcast context, but they don't have to cup their ears too hard to notice that triad of the core and the profiles and implementation tiers that you mentioned is identical to the cybersecurity framework. And that's by design. Stakeholders during the NIST Privacy Framework development process signaled very loud and clear that a desire for structural alignment between the two frameworks so that they could be used together with facility. And so that's what we did. And so I guess in a nutshell, the core is going to be a sort of we call it we like to describe it as a menu of privacy risk management outcomes and activities that organizations can select from based on a number of considerations like their mission and their privacy values, their compliance obligations, and their data processing activities writ large. They can take those into consideration and select from the privacy framework core to create a profile. And so the core is structured in a kind of increasingly granular set of outcomes and activities. So at the highest level, we have the functions There are 5 functions within the privacy framework, just as there are 5 functions within the NIST cybersecurity framework. In the privacy framework, our functions are identify, govern, control, communicate, and protect. So then when we move down into the more increasing granularity, you have categories within those functions, and then finally down to the subcategory level, which are the real granular outcomes and activities that organizations can pick from when they're looking to really implement their privacy risk management with specificity. So, again, one thing to really emphasize here is NIST is a non-regulatory agency. So this is not a legal document. It's not a compliance checklist and has no force of law because we are a non-regulatory agency. But, and so having said that, again, you're not going to necessarily just go down the entire list of core outcomes and activities and put them all in your profile. Instead, what you're going to want to do is, as I mentioned, kind of select from those that, like, it is a menu of options and say, okay, we've got these certain compliance obligations. We've got we know our general business environment and our mission, our values. We know that we are doing these types of data processing activities. We know what our risk tolerance is, or if they haven't done all these things, they can use the privacy framework to do those. Take those into consideration and then build out a current profile of where the organization is at right now. And then they can also create a target profile that has additional outcomes and activities that they have prioritized, but may not, have in place at the moment. And so then when you use the implementation tiers come into play in the sense that those are going to be organizational benchmarks to help drive a conversation around what needs to take place for us as an organization to get from our current profile to our target profile. And so it's not I get asked a lot, we all get asked a lot about, well, is this a maturity model when we're thinking about the implementation tiers? And the answer to that is no, it's not a maturity model. Instead, again, as I mentioned, it's an organizational benchmark. So the organization itself can decide where it's at in terms of its implementation based on its own metrics. So just to use a concrete example, if there's a certain outcome or activity in the NIST privacy framework, like, for example, data elements data elements can be accessed for deletion. So that's an example of one of our subcategories. Well, the organization could say, well, okay, we know that we've prioritized this, let's say, for example, because they have a deletion right obligation under one of the privacy laws that they're subject to. Well, what's the extent to which we have implemented this? So they could we have a 4-tier system that we've created in the privacy framework core. And so they can say, well, we think that, we're at a 1, let's say, for example, in our implementation of this outcome, but we want to be at a 3. And so let's figure out, what do we need to do to get there? Do we need more money? Do we need more workforce resources? What needs to take place? So that's where that sort of implementation tier can come in. And importantly, it's not a maturity model, right? Because that organization may not necessarily need to be at a 4. They could just need to be at a 3, but they may only be at a 1. So they've got to have the conversation about what it's going to take to get from 1 to 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very useful for driving investment and then targeting that towards your outcomes.
Yeah, and I think also, we've seen that, and you can apply those implementation tiers at any level of granularity within the core. It could be at the subcategory level, as I mentioned, but it could also be at the function level, a higher level, right? So those higher level descriptions of where the program is at. This can be a good way to do advocacy with organizational decision makers, like the C-suite, for example, to say, okay, let's give it just a quick and easy representation of where our privacy programs are right now at the function level, at the highest level, and where they need to be, right? And as a matter of fact, there's an organization that I highlight as in part of my presentations on this that did this very thing. They took their programmatic components when it came to privacy. And they did like a little heat map, like a red, green, yellow heat map of those components, and said, okay, when it comes to the identify function, for example, we want to be in the green, but we're in the yellow. So it's kind of like an implementation tier there, right? And so you can take that to decision makers so they can get that kind of aha moment of saying, I see, okay, so we're where we want to be in certain circumstances, but not where we need to be in others. So that's a good kind of lightweight use of the privacy framework that can help with getting that kind of advocacy that oftentimes those small but mighty privacy teams may need to help get the resources and support that they need to get to make sure that they are adequately addressing the privacy risks.
Sure, we've had some other in our series, some other presenters in our series of podcasts that have talked about different things about privacy. For example, Valerie Lyons talked about, doing privacy right, and talked about some of the different laws in Europe, such as GDPR. We also had Ann Kavukian on that talked about privacy by design and the principles for that. How do we bring all this together, and how do we work with those other laws and the California law and the GDPR and privacy by design principles, and how do we use all this together with the NIST Privacy Framework?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think one of the great benefits of the framework is it was designed for that very thing, to sort of take all these various elements of what it means to do privacy and help to put some structure around it and help organizations make sense of it. And that's very, the compliance landscape that you mentioned is the most top of mind for organizations. When you've got lots of state laws that have been coming online recently in the U.S. Of course, you have the GDPR. It feels like it's a long time ago now, really. But a number of other laws that are, being passed when it comes to privacy or data protection around the world. And so organizations, I think, understandably, have been quite focused on, well, how do we, manage all of this? Because if you're doing data, a good example could be something like a health tech company, let's say, like a company that's working with like a health wearable of some sort, and maybe collecting and processing data that is not necessarily, they may not necessarily be a HIPAA covered entity. So, they're kind of thinking, well, we don't have to deal with HIPAA, do we? It's like, well, yeah, but you may have to deal with CCPA, or / CPRA, the California law, or GDPR, if you have, sort of a touch point with the EU, various companies that or ones that may be legacy, subject to legacy laws like HIPAA or GLBA, but then want to start doing some data processing activity that may be, covered by some of these more general omnibus types of laws. And they're thinking, oh man, like we've got all these laws we have to deal with. What do we do? And so I think that's one of the great strengths of this privacy framework, is being able to you can map those compliance obligations to the NIST Privacy Framework outcomes and activities as a starting point with your privacy risk management.
Have you mapped those, and do you intend on doing that?
Yeah. So in our online resource repository, we have a number of mappings. We have a GDPR mapping. We have a CCPA / CPRA. Just thinking off the top of my head, the Virginia law, name of which escapes me, is in there. We do not have a HIPAA or a GLBA right now, actually. So to the extent that any of the listeners out there are interested, these are community generated. So we would love to have mappings to those laws. But when I was talking, I was talking to organizations to say, what is the extent to which there may be some barriers to privacy framework adoption? And they said, well, we've just been focused on compliance, and we like the framework and we want to get to it, but we just haven't had time yet. So, our response was, oh, well, you don't have to wait. You can go right into this and use your compliance, mappings as the starting point. And so we actually put together a webinar webinar back in December that had the stakeholders that created our GDPR mapping and our California CCPA mapping and our LGPD mapping, the Brazil data protection law, to come in and talk about their mappings and how they're, how that can be used as this sort of starting point. So, that's a good example of the privacy framework and how it can be used in the compliance context.
Sure. What do you see as the adoption at this point, and where do you see the framework going forward with?
So we've had great adoption. We do have to rely a bit on some anecdotal evidence most of the time. Things, for example, like downloads of the framework from our website, for example, which we get downloads from countries all over the world. But we did have some concrete data that came out actually the first year that the privacy framework came out, which was January of 2020. That was when version 1.0 was released, and that fall, the IAPP and Fair Warning released a report on privacy programs, and found that a quarter of those that were surveyed in that report had adopted the framework. So it was great to see already, even a few months in, that the organizations were turning to the framework. And it can be. It's not necessarily that you have to have this very, very heavy duty undertaking of the framework. Like we mentioned a little bit ago, you could just use the framework, for example, to help with kind of advocating for getting more resources to your privacy program. Seeing a lot of adoption in the U.S. and around the world, which is great to hear. And as far as next steps, well, an intermediate step that I would be remiss if I didn't mention was we spent a lot of time last year working on resources for small and medium businesses. And so, I kind of pounded the pavement to talk to stakeholders from SMBs, small and medium businesses, around what could we do to help, kind of getting back to your question a minute ago, what can we do to help demystify or simplify or help with privacy framework implementation for you all? And so we worked with them to create a quick start guide for small and medium businesses, which we released back in January of 2021. It's a little 2-page PDF that offers some, key questions to answer and activities to undertake for small and medium businesses that want to do the privacy framework implementation. And I will note there were a number of organizations that I talked to that were large organizations that still only may have had 1 or 2 folks doing privacy. So in some ways, it's not really just a SMB guide. It's just it's a guide for any organization that is looking to bolster, maybe establish or bolster their privacy program. So that was kind of last year. And then in the near future, I've been focusing a lot on sector-specific outreach, kind of with the healthcare sector, the financial sector as well, to help promote the framework and just sort of, raise awareness of what it is and how it can be used. And also kind of to your question from earlier, help to build out our resource repository, for example, with things like crosswalks to some of these legacy privacy laws.
No, I think that's very important, and I know when we put together the CISO Compass book, which started the CISO Stories podcast, the book it's called CISO Compass: Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers. And when I was putting together the privacy chapter, it's about 50 pages. And I just kept writing, and I realized, well, this isn't a privacy book. This is a security leadership book. But I felt that privacy is so important, and I've done several sessions at RSA, which was teaching privacy to security professionals, because everybody needs to know this. So it is very important. So we really do appreciate the work that you and your team have done at NIST. Any last things that you'd like to leave with our listeners before we leave?
I think just that, for folks to continue to keep top of mind how important trust is when it comes to privacy and data processing. I think the events of the past couple of years of the global pandemic have really underscored how critical it is that, an organization has the trust of its customers and its business partners when it comes to its data processing activities. Because, you can have a great technology, a real innovative technology or use of data, but if individuals don't trust it, they're not going to use it. And so we think that really the key benefit of many benefits of the NIST Privacy Framework is helping for organizations to establish that trust, which is so critical, and encourage folks to take a look at our resources and adopt the framework to help with this. And if they ever have any questions or would like to learn more, please never hesitate to reach out to me and our team over at NIST.
Well, thanks a lot, Dylan. I think that's great advice. And thanks for the work that you're doing and taking the time to help share this knowledge with us today.
And it's my pleasure, Todd. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Wiz is on a mission to help every organization rapidly identify and remove critical risks in their cloud environments. Purpose-built for the cloud, Wiz delivers full-stack visibility, accurate risk prioritization, and enhanced business agility. Wiz connects in minutes using an agentless approach that scans both platform configurations and inside every workload. We perform a deep assessment that goes beyond what standalone CSPM and CWPP tools offer to find the toxic combination of flaws that represent real risk. To learn more about Wiz, please visit securityweekly.com/Wiz.